The smell hit different when it was someone you knew. That was what nobody told you in basic, what the training manuals left out between their diagrams of proper loader positioning and emergency evacuation procedures. They showed you where the fire suppression handles were located. They drilled you on the sequence, pull, brace, evacuate. They never mentioned that when a melter beam punctured 3 inches of blessed ceramite and turned your commander into rendered fat, the smell would remind you of the mess hall on Emperor's Day when the cooks broke out the real meat rations. Staff Sergeant Derek Vance. That was the name they would put on the after-action report, the name that would appear in the commendation packet that some administratum clerk was probably already drafting. Sole survivor of heavy armor asset 7-7-4, designation Righteous Fury of Kalos, decorated for valor, recommended for promotion. I could still taste Bradley in the back of my throat. The Medicae tent stank of counterseptic and low smoke, and I lay on a cot while some bone-tired chirurgeon picked shrapnel out of my left arm without anesthetic because they had run out 6 hours ago, and the convoy with fresh supplies had hit a mine somewhere on the Argent Highway. The pain was distant, filtered through whatever shock was still cushioning my nervous system from the full weight of what had happened. I watched the chirurgeon work like I was watching someone else's body being repaired, some other guardsman's flesh being tweezed and sutured and bandaged. My crew had died screaming. Well, most of them had screamed. Marcus never made a sound, which was strange because he had been closest to the breach point. The melter beam had come through the forward glacis at an angle none of us had anticipated, a shot that should have been impossible according to everything we knew about the enemy's weapon emplacements. One moment Marcus was working the drive controls, muttering prayers to the machine spirit the way replacement drivers always did when they were still trying to earn the tank's trust, and the next moment there was light brighter than a sun and Marcus simply was not there anymore. His seat was there. His hands were there, still gripping the control yokes, severed clean at the wrists where the beam had intersected his forearms. But Marcus himself had ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, converted instantaneously from a 23-year-old human being into component atoms and a brief spike of thermal radiation. The rest of us were not so lucky. I kept thinking about that, lying on the Medicae cot while the chirurgeon muttered curses at the depth of the metal fragments embedded in my tricep. Lucky. That was the word people kept using. You were lucky, Sergeant Vance. Emperor's own luck, surviving a direct melter hit. Someone was watching out for you. Yeah. Someone was watching while Tyler cooked. The melter beam had superheated the interior atmosphere of the Righteous Fury to something approaching 800 degrees in the span of 2 seconds. The emergency bulkheads had slammed down automatically, the tank's machine spirit trying desperately to contain the damage, but the bulkhead between the driver's compartment and the main fighting space had warped in the heat and sealed imperfectly. Hot enough to kill, not hot enough to kill quick. Tyler had been loading a fresh shell into the main gun when it happened. He was good at his job, precise and economical in his movements, and he had the 70-pound high-explosive round halfway into the breach when the temperature in our sealed metal coffin suddenly exceeded the tolerance of human tissue. I saw his skin change color. That was the thing I could not stop seeing when I closed my eyes, would probably never stop seeing until the Emperor granted me the mercy of death. The way Tyler's skin went from the healthy brown of a son of Kalos to something redder, then darker in the span of a heartbeat, the way the flesh on his hands bubbled where it gripped the shell casing. He dropped the round. It hit the deck with a clang that I should not have been able to hear over my own screaming, but somehow I heard it, and somehow I also heard the sound Tyler made, which was not really a scream at all but more of a wheeze, because his throat was cooking from the inside out and his lungs were filling with fluid as the alveoli ruptured. Bradley got the worst of it, and the best of it, depending on how you measured such things. Lieutenant Bradley Shaw had been my commander for 11 months, a prosperine by birth, pale-skinned and red-haired the way they all were, with the kind of calm precision that made him perfect for armor command. He never raised his voice, never panicked. When the shells started falling, Bradley's voice over the internal vox was the same flat tone he used when discussing maintenance schedules or ration distribution. He had saved our lives 6 times that I could count, reading the battlefield with an intuition that bordered on precognition, calling out maneuvers split seconds before enemy fire would have found us. He had also put us in the kill zone. I kept coming back to that, kept worrying at it like a sore tooth. Bradley had ordered Marcus to push forward into that narrow defile between the ruined Factorum and the collapsed Habstack, despite the tactical doctrine that said armor should never enter confined spaces without infantry support, despite the warning runes that had been flickering on the auspex for the past 3 hours, despite Marcus questioning the order which replacements almost never did. "You sure about this, sir?" Marcus had asked, his voice tight with the particular nervousness of a man who had only been with us for 2 weeks and was still learning the rhythms of the crew. "Seems like a good spot for an ambush." Bradley had not answered. He had just repeated the order, his voice somehow even flatter than usual, and Marcus had obeyed because that was what guardsmen did. We all obeyed. We pushed into the defile at combat speed, treads chewing through the debris of 10,000 years of urban decay, and 30 seconds later a melter gun that should not have been there at all punched a hole through our armor and killed everyone I cared about, almost everyone. The chirurgeon finished with my arm and moved on to the burns on my neck and shoulder, the places where my uniform had melted into my skin before the emergency bulkhead finally sealed properly and cut me off from the furnace that had been my crew compartment. I had been in the commander's cupola when it happened, up in the turret space where the temperature spike had been marginally less lethal due to the open hatch above me. Bradley had ordered me up there to spot for enemy movement, another decision that seemed strange in retrospect, since spotting was normally his job and he had never delegated it before. Had he known? The thought made my stomach churn, and I had to clamp down hard on the urge to vomit. The Medicae tent was full of wounded guardsmen, men and women who had survived the day's assault with their bodies broken in various horrible ways, and the last thing any of them needed was some tank crewman losing his rations all over the floor because he could not handle the smell of counterseptic. But the nausea was not really about the counterseptic, it was about the other smell, the one that had baked into my uniform and my hair and my skin, the one I could still detect underneath the chemical sharpness of the medical supplies. Cooked meat. That was what it smelled like. Not burning, not charring, but cooking. The slow process of proteins denaturing and fats rendering and connective tissue breaking down under sustained heat. When you burned meat, it blackened and crisped and eventually turned to carbon. When you cooked meat, it browned and softened and released its juices and smelled like food. Tyler and Bradley had cooked. I had crawled through what was left of them to reach the emergency release lever. The chirurgeon noticed my distress and paused in her work, her weathered face creasing with something that might have been sympathy or might have just been exhaustion. "You need a bucket, Sergeant?" I shook my head. The nausea subsided, replaced by a hollow numbness that I recognized as my mind's way of protecting itself from information it was not ready to process. The chirurgeon shrugged and went back to debriding my burns, and I stared at the canvas ceiling of the Medicae tent and tried to remember the last thing Bradley had said before the world ended. The vox had crackled. That was the detail I kept circling back to, the piece of the puzzle that did not fit with the others. We had been in the defile for maybe 15 seconds when the short-range vox had crackled with static, and through the static I'd heard something that might have been a voice, and Bradley had looked up at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Then the light, then the heat, then the screaming. What had the voice said? What had Bradley's expression meant? I could not remember. The memories were there, I could feel them lurking just beneath the surface of my consciousness like creatures moving under dark water, but every time I tried to focus on them they slipped away. Trauma, the chirurgeon would probably say, the mind protecting itself from experiences too extreme to process. Perfectly normal response to watching your crew cook alive. But it did not feel like trauma. It felt like something else. It felt like I was forgetting on purpose. The evacuation had been a nightmare that I remembered only in fragments. The emergency release lever jammed at first, the metal warped by the heat, and I had to brace my boots against the turret ring and pull with every ounce of strength my burned and shocked body could muster. The lever came free with a shriek of tortured metal, and suddenly the hatch above me was open, and I was climbing out into air that tasted like promethium and ash, and was still somehow the sweetest thing I had ever breathed. I had fallen off the side of the tank, not climbed down, not jumped, just fallen, my muscles giving out the moment I cleared the hatch. I hit the rubble-strewn ground hard enough to crack at least 2 ribs, but I barely felt it because every nerve ending in my body was already screaming about the burns and the smoke inhalation and the particular agony of having watched 2 men die without being able to do anything to help them. The righteous fury was burning. Not the clean blue flame of promethium combustion, but a darker, oilier fire fed by lubricants and ammunition propellant and whatever was left of my crewmates. The smoke that poured from the open hatch was black and greasy and smelled like a crematorium operating at 3 times capacity. I lay in the rubble and watched my tank burn and thought about nothing at all. The rescue team found me an hour later, a squad of infantry from the 77th Kalos Rifles, doing a sweep of the engagement zone for survivors and salvage. They had nearly shot me, mistaking my blackened, blood-covered form for an enemy combatant, and I had been too deep in shock to correct their assumption until one of them recognized the unit patches on what remained of my uniform. "Emperor's Throne," one of them had said. "That is the crew from 7 to 7-4. Someone get a Medicae over here, now." They carried me back to the forward aid station on an improvised stretcher made from a blast door and 2 lasguns. I watched the sky scroll past above me, grey and smoke-hazed, and listened to the distant thunder of artillery and the closer crack of las fire, and thought about how strange it was that the battle was still going on, that the war had not paused even for a moment to acknowledge the deaths of Marcus and Tyler and Bradley. The Imperium did not mourn individuals. That was one of the first things you learned in the Guard. The Imperium was too vast, too old, too embattled to spend its grief on single soldiers. Men died by the millions in wars that lasted centuries, and the great machinery of humanity's defense ground on regardless, fed by an endless supply of fresh bodies from a million worlds. My crew was a rounding error in the day's casualty figures, a statistical blip that would be filed and forgotten before the week was out. But I remembered them. That was the curse of surviving. The chirurgeon finished with my burns and began bandaging my arm, her movements efficient and impersonal. Around us, the Medicae tent buzzed with the sounds of suffering, groans and whimpers, and the occasional scream as some chirurgeon probed too deep or some casualty's anesthesia wore off at the wrong moment. I let the sounds wash over me without really hearing them, lost in the labyrinth of my own fragmented memories. Marcus had been with us for 2 weeks. Just 2 weeks. He had replaced our previous driver, Jenkins, who had been transferred to a different unit under circumstances that no one had adequately explained. Jenkins had been with us for 3 years, a veteran of a dozen major engagements, and then one day he was just gone, and Marcus was in his seat, and Bradley had told us not to ask questions about it. That had seemed strange at the time. It seemed stranger now. Jenkins had been the one who first noticed the warning runes on the Auspex 3 days before the attack that killed my crew. Little flickers of amber in the corner of the display, so brief that you could miss them if you were not paying attention. "Machine spirit is unhappy about something," Jenkins had said, frowning at the cogitator. "I will run a diagnostic." But he had been transferred before he could complete the diagnostic, and Marcus had not known to look for the warning runes, and I had forgotten about them entirely until now. What had the machine spirit been trying to tell us? The question lodged in my brain like a splinter, impossible to ignore. The righteous fury had been a cantankerous vehicle, old even by Imperial Guard standards, its machine spirit developed over centuries of service into something that approached genuine awareness. It had likes and dislikes. It ran better for some drivers than others. It had saved our lives more than once by alerting us to dangers that the Auspex should not have been able to detect. Had it been warning us about the melter emplacement in the defile? Had it known somehow, sensed through whatever arcane channels machine spirits used to perceive the world, that death was waiting for us in that narrow passage between the ruined buildings? And if so, why had Bradley ignored the warnings? I sat up on the cot, suddenly certain that I needed to see the wreck of the righteous fury, that there was something there I had missed, some piece of evidence that would make sense of the senseless death of my friends. The chirurgeon made a noise of protest and tried to push me back down, but I shrugged off her hands and swung my legs over the side of the cot, ignoring the way the movement sent fire racing up my arm and across my shoulder. "Sergeant Vance, you are in no condition to move," the chirurgeon said, her voice sharp with professional concern. "You have second-degree burns over 15% of your body, at least 2 cracked ribs, and probable smoke damage to your lungs. You need rest and observation." "I need to see my tank," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, flat and dead in a way that reminded me of how Bradley had sounded in those last minutes. "There is something I need to check. Your tank is a burned-out wreck. There is nothing to see." "There is something I need to check," I repeated, and the chirurgeon must have seen something in my eyes that convinced her further argument was pointless, because she sighed and stepped back and let me stand. The world tilted when I got to my feet. I grabbed the frame of the cot and waited for the dizziness to pass, breathing through clenched teeth against the pain that was finally starting to break through my shock. My uniform was ruined, the fabric charred and melted in places, stiff with dried blood in others. Someone had removed my boots at some point, and my feet were bare against the cold metal deck plating of the Medicaid tent. I found my boots under the cot, pulled them on with fingers that shook only slightly, and walked out into the war. The forward operating base was a chaos of activity, guardsmen and vehicles and supplies, moving in patterns that looked random but followed the deep logic of military necessity. Chimeras rumbled past carrying fresh troops to the front. Medicaid vehicles returned with loads of wounded. Tech adepts swarmed over damaged tanks and transports, their mechadendrites flickering as they performed battlefield repairs. The air was thick with exhaust fumes and the ozone tang of las fire and the ever-present smoke from a dozen burning buildings. I walked through it all like a ghost, unnoticed and unremarkable, just another wounded guardsman moving through the chaos, one of thousands who would pass through this base today alone. No one asked where I was going, no one tried to stop me. The Imperium was too busy fighting to notice one damaged soldier wandering toward the vehicle recovery yard. The righteous fury was there, hauled in by a recovery vehicle at some point during my treatment. It sat among a dozen other wrecks, vehicles too damaged to repair but not yet stripped for salvage, and even among that company of destruction it stood out. The melter hit had turned the forward third of the tank into a twisted sculpture of slag and ruin. The blessed ceramite armor melted and reformed into shapes that suggested organic growth more than mechanical construction. The driver's compartment was simply gone, replaced by a jagged hole that looked disturbingly like a wound. I approached slowly, my boots crunching on the gravel of the recovery yard. The smell hit me when I got within 10 meters, the smell of cooked meat and burned metal and something else, something chemical that I could not identify. My stomach lurched but did not revolt, and I kept walking until I stood beside what had been my home for 11 months. The machine's spirit was dead. I could feel its absence like a missing tooth, a hollow where something should have been. The righteous fury had been more than a vehicle to me, more than a tool of war. It had been a presence, a partner, a cantankerous old friend who grumbled at the cold and purred when you treated it right. Now it was just metal, just wreckage. But there was something wrong with the wreckage. It took me a moment to identify what I was seeing, my burned and exhausted brain struggling to process the visual information. The melter hit had come from the front. That much was obvious from the angle of the slag and the pattern of the damage. But there was another mark on the hull, smaller and easier to miss, on the left side of the turret just below the commander's cupola, a scorch mark. Circular, maybe 15 centimeters across, with a distinctive spiral pattern at the center. I knew that pattern. Every tank crewman in the Imperial Guard knew that pattern. It was the signature of a Vox-guided targeting designator, the kind used by forward observers to direct precision fire onto enemy positions. Someone had painted the righteous fury for a kill shot. I reached out and touched the scorch mark, my fingers tracing the spiral pattern. The metal was cold now, hours removed from the heat that had created it, but I could feel something else under my fingertips, a residue, waxy and slightly tacky, that should not have been there. Targeting designators did not leave residue. They were laser-based systems, light and nothing more. This was something different, something I had seen before in the lectures on enemy capabilities that were part of every guardsman's training. A traitor's mark, the kind used by infiltrators and saboteurs to identify targets for elimination. My hand started to shake, not from the cold or the shock or the pain, but from the implications of what I was seeing. The righteous fury had not been destroyed by bad luck or enemy skill. It had been marked for death by someone with access to the Imperial Guard's own communication frequencies. Someone who knew exactly where we would be and when. Someone who had ordered us into that defile. Bradley. The name hit me like a physical blow, and I staggered back from the tank, my mind racing through the events of the past 2 weeks with new eyes. Bradley's strange behavior, the unexplained transfer of Jenkins, the warnings from the machine spirit that had gone unheeded, the Vox transmission that had come just before the melter hit. Bradley had known, and he had led us into the kill zone anyway. But why? Why would a decorated officer, a man who had fought for the Imperium for 15 years, betray his own crew? I thought about the expression on Bradley's face in those last moments, the one I had seen just before the light and the heat and the death. I had assumed it was fear. I had assumed it was the look of a man who knew he was about to die. But that was not what I had seen. That was not the memory that lurked beneath the surface of my trauma-fractured consciousness. Bradley had been smiling. I sat down heavily on the gravel, my legs giving out as the full weight of the revelation crashed down on me. My commander had been a traitor. He had worn the uniform and spoken the prayers and bled beside us for months, and all of it had been a lie. He had been waiting for the right moment, the right opportunity, to deliver us to our enemies. And I had survived because he had wanted me to survive. That was the part I could not understand, the piece that did not fit. If Bradley had been a traitor, if his mission had been to kill his crew, why send me up to the cupola? Why give me a chance to escape? It would have been easy enough to keep me in the crew compartment, to let the heat take me along with Tyler and Marcus, unless I was not supposed to die, unless I had a role to play in whatever larger design had claimed the lives of my crewmates. The thought made my skin crawl, and not just from the burns. I looked down at my hands, at the blistered and bandaged flesh that had hauled me out of the burning tank, and wondered what I had been saved for. What purpose a traitor might have seen in keeping one guardsman alive. I needed answers. I needed to find out who Bradley had been working for, what larger conspiracy had led to the death of my crew, and I needed to do it without alerting whoever was behind this that I knew. If the enemy had assets inside the Imperial Guard capable of subverting tank commanders, they would certainly have assets capable of silencing inconvenient survivors. I stood up, my resolve hardening into something cold and determined. The pain was still there, the shock and the grief and the survivor's guilt, but they were distant now, filtered through the lens of a new purpose. I would find out who had killed my friends. I would track the conspiracy to its source. And when I found the people responsible, I would make them pay. But first I needed more information. And there was only one place I could think of to get it: the cogitator logs. Every Imperial guard tank had a black box, a hardened data storage unit, designed to survive even the most catastrophic vehicle destruction. It recorded everything: Vox transmissions, Auspex readings, crew communications, even the vital signs of the crew members. If there was evidence of Bradley's treachery, it would be in those logs. The problem was getting to them. The cogitator would be in the wreckage of the Righteous Fury, probably still intact given how well protected the units were, but extracting it would require tools and time, and an explanation for why I was poking around in the remains of my own tank. I could not do this alone. I needed help from someone with technical skills and no loyalty to whoever was pulling Bradley's strings. I thought about the tech adepts I had seen working on damaged vehicles at the edge of the recovery yard. Most of them would be too busy or too indifferent to help a random guardsman, but I remembered one face from the months I had spent with the Righteous Fury. An Enginseer named Theodora Vex, who had serviced our tank before the campaign began, back when we were still stationed at Base Kalos. She had been efficient and competent, but more importantly, she had treated the machine spirit with genuine respect rather than the rote reverence most tech priests showed. The Righteous Fury had run better for weeks after her ministrations. If anyone could extract the cogitator logs without asking too many questions, it would be her. I left the recovery yard and made my way toward the technical section of the forward base, moving slowly to avoid aggravating my injuries and to give myself time to think. My story would need to be good. Enginseers were not known for their emotional intelligence, but Theodora had struck me as more perceptive than most. If I came to her with a wild tale of treachery and conspiracy, she would probably dismiss me as a traumatized soldier suffering from delusions. But if I came to her with a request to retrieve the machine spirit's final records, a last act of devotion to a fallen vehicle, she might understand. I found Theodora in a makeshift shrine set up beside the maintenance tents, her mechadendrites coiled around her shoulders as she performed the rite of maintenance on a damaged Chimera engine block. The shrine was small but elaborate, festooned with the symbols of the machine god and lit by banks of flickering electro candles. The air smelled of sacred oils and burned circuitry. She looked up as I approached, her augmetic eyes whirring as they focused on my face. "Sergeant Vance, I heard about the Righteous Fury. My condolences on the loss of your crew and your vehicle." Her voice was flat, almost mechanical, but there was something in the way she said the words that suggested genuine sympathy, or at least as close to sympathy as a tech priest could manage. "Thank you, Enginseer. I need to ask a favor." Her mechadendrites twitched, an unusual request given the circumstances. "What kind of favor?" I took a deep breath, letting the pain and the grief show on my face. It was not difficult. They were always there, lurking just beneath the surface. The Righteous Fury served faithfully for 63 years. It saved my life more times than I can count. I want to recover its cogitator logs to preserve the machine spirit's final records. I owe it that much. Theodora was silent for a long moment, her augmetic eyes studying me with an intensity that made me wonder if she could see more than I wanted to show. Then she nodded once, a noble sentiment. The machine spirits of our vehicles deserve to have their service remembered. "I will help you." "Thank you," I said, and the relief I felt was not entirely feigned. "When can we do it?" "Now," Theodora said, setting aside the engine block she had been working on. "The Omnicia teaches that devotion should not be delayed. Lead me to your vehicle, Sergeant Vance. We will retrieve the records before the salvage crews strip the wreckage for parts." We walked back to the recovery yard together, Theodora's robe swishing against the gravel as her mechadendrites made constant small adjustments to the equipment attached to her belt. She did not ask questions about the attack, did not probe for details about how my crew had died. I was grateful for her silence, even as I wondered if it was merely professional discretion or something more. The righteous fury looked even more damaged in the fading afternoon light, its once proud form reduced to a monument of destruction. Theodora circled the wreck slowly, her augmetic eyes cataloguing every detail of the damage. "A melter weapon," she said finally, "high-powered. The angle of entry suggests an elevated firing position, approximately 37 degrees above horizontal. The enemy had the high ground. They were waiting for us," I said, and something in my voice made Theodora pause and look at me more closely. "Waiting? We were ordered into a position that we should never have entered. Armor doctrine says we should have had infantry support, we should have scouted the approach, we should have done a dozen things differently. Instead, we drove straight into the kill zone and caught a melter beam to the face." Theodora's mechadendrites flexed. "You believe the attack was planned, that your vehicle was deliberately targeted?" I hesitated, weighing how much to reveal. The scorch mark on the hull was still there, the spiral pattern of the targeting designator clearly visible in the dying light. If I showed it to Theodora, I would be committing to a path that might lead to my own death, but if I did not, if I kept my suspicions to myself, I would never find out who had killed my friends. I showed her the mark. Her reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Every mechadendrite on her body went rigid, and a series of clicking sounds emerged from somewhere deep in her throat. The augmetic equivalent of a gasp. "Do you know what this is?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I know what it looks like," I said, "but I want to hear you say it." Theodora traced the spiral pattern with one delicate mechadendrite, her touch as reverent and horrified as a priest examining a heretical text. "A quantum-entangled targeting beacon," she said. "Military grade. The kind issued only to certain specialized units within the Imperial command structure." "Which units?" Theodora hesitated, her augmetic eyes flickering through spectra I could not perceive. "Intelligence assets, inquisitorial operatives, certain elements of the Officio Assassinorum." She paused. "And the commissariat, the enforcers of loyalty within the Imperial Guard. The men and women tasked with ensuring that guardsmen fought and died with appropriate dedication to the Emperor's cause." I felt the blood drain from my face. My crew had not been killed by enemy action, we had been assassinated by our own side. But why? What possible reason could the commissariat have to target a single tank crew? "The cogitator logs," I said. "We need them now." Theodora nodded, her earlier hesitation gone. She understood now that this was not just a matter of honoring a fallen vehicle. This was something larger, something darker, and she had chosen to help me uncover it. She produced a cutting tool from her robes and began working on the wreckage, her mechadendrites probing for the black box while her cutting beams sliced through the warped metal that blocked access to the storage compartment. I stood watch, scanning the recovery yard for anyone who might be taking too much interest in our activities, but the area was deserted. The salvage crews had not yet arrived, and the other guardsmen in the base were too focused on their own problems to notice two figures working on a burned-out tank. The cogitator logs were intact, as I had hoped. Theodora extracted the black box with careful precision, her mechadendrites cradling the device like a sacred relic. It was smaller than I had expected, maybe the size of a human skull, its surface blackened by heat, but its integrity uncompromised. "I can access the data," Theodora said, "but not here. I will need my full analysis equipment and privacy. There may be encryption protocols that will take time to break." "Where?" "My quarters. It is not far. We left the recovery yard as the sun began to set. the sky turning the color of dried blood above the smoke-hazed horizon. The sounds of battle had faded to a distant rumble, the day's fighting winding down as both sides pulled back to lick their wounds and prepare for tomorrow. I walked beside Theodora in silence, the black box tucked under her robes, and tried to ignore the growing sense that I was being watched. Theodora's quarters were in a converted storage container at the edge of the technical section, a cramped space filled with equipment and data slates and the accumulated detritus of a life devoted to the machine god. She cleared a space on her workbench and set the black box down, then began connecting cables and probes with the ease of long practice. "This will take time," she said. "The encryption is sophisticated. Whoever placed that beacon did not want their activities discovered." "How long?" "Several hours. Perhaps the whole night. You should rest, Sergeant Vance. You are injured, and whatever we find in these logs will require you to be clear-headed." She was right. I could feel my body starting to give out, the adrenaline that had sustained me through the afternoon finally running dry. The burns on my arm and shoulder were a constant throb of pain, and my cracked ribs made every breath an exercise in endurance. I needed rest. I needed time to process everything I had learned, but I could not sleep, not with the smell of Tyler's cooked flesh still clinging to my skin, not with the image of Bradley's smile burned into my memory. "I will wait," I said, and settled into a corner of Theodora's quarters with my back against the wall and my eyes on the door. The night passed in fragments. I drifted in and out of consciousness, unable to truly sleep but too exhausted to stay fully awake. Every time I closed my eyes I saw the melter beam, the light brighter than a sun, and Marcus's hands still gripping the control yokes. Every time I opened them I saw Theodora hunched over her workbench, her mechadendrites dancing across the black box as she worked to crack its secrets. At some point she brought me water and a ration bar, and I ate and drank without tasting anything. The burns on my arm had started to seep through the bandages, a slow ooze of clear fluid that stained the fabric pink. I ignored it. The pain was a reminder that I was still alive, still capable of pursuing the truth, still able to avenge my friends. Dawn was starting to lighten the sky when Theodora finally looked up from her work. "I found something," she said, and her voice was strange, tight, almost frightened. I pushed myself to my feet and crossed to the workbench, ignoring the protests of my battered body. The data slate in front of Theodora was filled with scrolling text, but one section was highlighted in red, and I leaned in to read it. It was a Vox transmission, received by the Righteous Fury approximately 30 seconds before the melter hit. The encryption had obscured most of the content, but Theodora had managed to recover several key phrases: asset compromised, authorize immediate termination, collateral acceptable, and at the bottom a signature I recognized. A code that had been drilled into my head during basic training, taught to every guardsman as the ultimate symbol of Imperial authority. The Inquisition. I stepped back from the workbench, my legs suddenly unsteady. Not the Commissariat, the Inquisition, the most powerful and secretive organization in the entire Imperium, answerable to no one except the Emperor himself. Why would the Inquisition want to kill a tank crew? "There is more," Theodora said. She swiped to another section of the data. "This is from the Auspex logs, 3 days before the attack. Your previous driver, the one called Jenkins, was conducting a diagnostic when he detected something unusual. The screen showed a series of readings that meant nothing to me, just numbers and symbols in a format I did not understand. But Theodora's expression told me they meant something to her. "What am I looking at?" "Evidence of unauthorized Vox communications," she said. "Someone on your crew was transmitting data on frequencies that should not have been accessible from a standard guard vehicle. Encrypted bursts, short duration, almost impossible to detect unless you knew exactly what to look for." "Who?" Theodora hesitated. "The transmissions originated from the commander's station, Lieutenant Shaw, Bradley. Bradley had been transmitting secret messages to someone outside the chain of command. Bradley had been a spy, but a spy for whom? If the Inquisition had ordered his termination, that meant he was not working for them. So who had he been reporting to? "There is one more file," Theodora said. She swiped again, and a new document appeared on the screen. "I do not understand all of it. The terminology is unfamiliar, even to me, but I think you need to see it." The document was heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out or replaced with strings of meaningless characters, but enough remained to piece together a picture, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a personnel file, Bradley's personnel file, but not the official one that would have been kept by the Departamento Munitorum. This was something else, something that listed his true name, his true history, his true allegiance. Prosperine, that was what they called themselves. A cult devoted to a figure called the Primordial Annihilator, a power from beyond the veil of reality. They had been operating within the Imperial Guard for centuries, hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And Bradley had been one of them. The melter hit, the assassination order from the Inquisition, my survival, all of it suddenly made horrible sense. The Inquisition had discovered the cult infiltration and ordered Bradley's elimination before he could complete whatever mission he had been assigned. The melter emplacement had been their kill team, positioned to take out Bradley and anyone around him when the opportunity arose. They had not cared about collateral damage. Tyler and Marcus had been acceptable losses in their war against the cult, and I had survived only because the Inquisition's kill team had been sloppy, or because the Emperor had other plans for me, or because someone wanted me to find this information. I looked at the document again, at the redacted sections and the fragments of text that remained visible. This file had been on the black box. It should not have been there. The cogitator logs were supposed to record operational data, not classified intelligence files. Someone had put it there for me to find. I turned to Theodora, intending to ask her if she had noticed any signs of tampering, but the words died in my throat. She was standing very still, her mechadendrites frozen in positions that suggested she had been reaching for something on her belt, and her augmetic eyes were focused on a point just over my shoulder. "Do not move, Sergeant Vance," a voice said from behind me. A voice I recognized, though I could not immediately place it. I turned slowly, keeping my hands visible, and found myself looking at a figure in a black coat with a rosette of silver and obsidian hanging from a chain around their neck. An inquisitorial rosette, the symbol of absolute authority. The figure was a woman, tall and severe, with grey hair cropped close to her skull and eyes that had seen horrors I could not imagine. She held a bolt pistol in one steady hand, the weapon pointed at the center of my chest. "Mira Kane, Ordo Hereticus," she said. "You have been accessing classified information, Sergeant Vance. I am here to determine whether you are a threat to the Imperium or an asset." I stared at her, at the weapon, at the rosette that gave her the power to execute me on the spot if she judged me unworthy of continued existence, and I felt something unexpected. Not fear, though fear was there, lurking at the edges of my consciousness. Not anger, though anger simmered beneath the surface. Relief. "I have been waiting for you," I said, and the words surprised me even as they left my mouth. But they were true. Some part of me had known, since the moment I saw the targeting beacon on my tank's hull, that this was where the path would lead. Inquisitor Kane's expression did not change, but something flickered in her eyes, amusement perhaps, or recognition. "I know," she said. "That is why I arranged for you to survive." The words hit me like a blow to the gut. You ordered the strike on my crew." "I ordered the strike on Prosperine asset Bradley Shaw," Kane corrected. "Your crewmates were regrettable casualties, but the cult's infiltration had progressed too far to allow a subtle approach. Shaw was scheduled to receive new orders within the week, orders that would have cost the Imperium far more than 3 lives. "What orders?" Kane holstered her bolt pistol, a gesture that somehow felt more threatening than having it pointed at me. That is classified information, Sergeant Vance. But I can tell you this. Your commander was not just a spy. He was a bomb waiting to go off, and the cult had given him a target. Me, I said, and the realization crystallized in my mind with horrible clarity. I was the target. Kane nodded. Your bloodline carries certain traits that the cult finds valuable, traits that Shaw was supposed to assess and, if confirmed, deliver to his masters. When he transmitted his final report 3 days ago, confirming that you were indeed suitable for their purposes, I knew we had run out of time. What traits? What are you talking about? Kane studied me for a long moment, her grey eyes unreadable. Have you ever wondered, Sergeant Vance, why you survived when so many others did not? Why the righteous Fury's machine spirit favored you above the rest of your crew? Why the heat that should have killed you only burned? I had not wondered. I had been too busy trying to understand what had happened to question the mechanics of my survival, but now that she mentioned it, the question seemed obvious. The cupola had been exposed to the same thermal surge as the rest of the crew compartment. I should have cooked just like Tyler and Bradley. Instead, I had walked away with second-degree burns. You have a gift, Kane said. A mutation, if you prefer a less charitable term. Your body is resistant to heat in ways that should not be possible for an unaugmented human. The cult calls it the flame mark, and they believe it indicates a connection to powers best left unnamed. I am not a mutant, I said, but even as the words left my mouth I remembered other things. The times I had pulled hot shell casings from the breach without gloves and felt only mild discomfort. The forge world where I had walked through a steam leak that should have scalded the flesh from my bones and emerged with nothing more than reddened skin. The Inquisition has a different view, Kane said. We believe your resistance is a gift from the Emperor himself, a mark of his favor bestowed upon those he chooses for special service. What kind of service? Kane smiled, and the expression transformed her face from severe to something almost kind. I have need of someone who can walk through fire and emerge unburned, someone who has seen the enemy's face and survived, someone who understands the cost of this war and is willing to pay it anyway. She extended her hand. Join me, Derek Vance. Help me hunt the cult that murdered your friends, become the weapon they tried to make you, but turn that weapon against them. I looked at her hand. I thought about Marcus, who had been with us for only 2 weeks and never had a chance to learn the rhythms of the crew. I thought about Tyler, whose last sound had been a wheeze as his lungs filled with fluid. I thought about Bradley, who had smiled as he led us to our deaths. And I thought about the smell of cooking meat that still clung to my skin, that would probably cling to my soul for the rest of my life. The smell of my friends dying. I took Kane's hand. The Inquisitor's grip was strong, her skin cold and dry, and something passed between us in that moment. A bargain, a binding, the beginning of a new war. What do I do first? I asked. Kane released my hand and turned toward the door of Theodora's quarters. First, she said, you learn everything I can teach you about the cult, their symbols, their rituals, their weaknesses, and then we start hunting. She paused at the door and looked back at me. But before any of that, you need to understand something. The fire that killed your crew, the fire you survived, that was just the beginning. Where we are going, the flames will be far hotter. I thought about the heat of the melter beam, the temperature that had cooked Tyler and Bradley and reduced Marcus to component atoms. I thought about the 800 degrees that had seared my flesh but failed to kill me. I can handle it, I said. Kane smiled again, and this time there was no kindness in it, only the cold satisfaction of a predator who had found exactly the weapon she needed. I know, she said. That is why I chose you. She walked out into the morning light, and I followed her, leaving behind the wreckage of my old life and stepping into a new one. Behind me, Theodora's mechadendrites clicked in what might have been a blessing or a warning. The smell of cooked meat followed me out of the door. Some things I was beginning to understand you could never wash away.